I think it was already quite a lot of listening. We went through the first phase, we went through half of the second phase, and so far as we looked at bringing up at least power sharing during peace negotiations, we will continue looking a little bit more at power sharing in post-agreement constitution making and so on. But before we continue, I would invite you, you sit very well for that, to always in threes, quickly discuss and find out what is the one or the two most provocative questions when you think of dealing with power sharing in, let's say, in such a conflict, in a conflict context. Always in threes, and we will just have a little bit of whispering discussion for, let's say, or you can stay in four if you want, three, four, and fours and threes, so that it just fits. An impression, what were you talking about? What is?
That's very difficult. We've been solving the world in these 5 minutes.
That's right.
What we figure out, and what we think what is a very interesting aspect or important aspect is differentiating out the power brokers in a given conflict, and then sort of putting them on the scale. Where do they fit in, at what time, at what level of negotiation, of agreeing on a power share, or of finding solutions to power sharing agreements.
That would already go a little bit into, contradict me if I misunderstood, this would already go then a little bit into bring them in at different times, at different roles.
Possibly.
Linked with sequencing perhaps then also.
That's where we ended up, you know, where we kind of didn't really.
Okay.
And there were also two questions regarding how to remove blocking.
Perhaps the next group can.
Okay, we had like 3 main questions going through the whole process. First, the question we talked before earlier, how to deal with perpetrators, how can they be included? Yeah, this crucial question. And if yes, how? And then really very concretely, how to bring the different parties at the table, just and make them talk and maintain a dialogue. And then afterwards, if an agreement can be reached, how can you assure that it will be implemented? I mean, talking is the first step, but then acting is the next one.
Right.
Maybe I would like to say something about the first. It wasn't that much about that. Or differently, I meant with perpetrators that you have quite often the situation that peace talks after a conflict situation, the perpetrators are still in the position of power. And how do you deal with this situation that there are peace talks going on the other hand, there are still the perpetrators in the same position, like within the politics. And I have always in my mind, there is no good coming out of it, so you can't really establish peace if the perpetrators are still in the same position as they were before. So that was what I meant.
Ok, excusez-moi. Oui. Ma question, c'était juste ici, comment ramener 2 belligérants sur une table de négociation
How to bring 2 conflicting parties to a table.
Et se séparer avec satisfaction.
And that they can go away with satisfaction.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some critical reflections, and my first reflection on the power sharing idea is different cultural institutional context. Before starting to talk about this power sharing, you probably have to think about why in some situations, in some countries, this mechanism works, and why not in others. Take, for example, Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, or Kyrgyzstan conflicts, or many other situations in Asia or in other parts of the world where this mechanism doesn't work. So what are conditions for power sharing? And we probably, Gazim, will continue with your question.
My question was, how can the international community more pressure make? Which?
For making the agreement or for implementation? Well, role of international community, I just put, huh? Okay.
During the negotiations process.
Mm-hmm.
Well, basically, this was my question as well, because we have different cases. For example, in Macedonia, the whole international community was, had one goal, but I think that in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, they have like different goals. So maybe that's why we still don't have like negotiation process and resolving the conflict at the end. So I think that the role of the international community is quite big in this power sharing thing.
Maybe as a last question or comment, more than also when we talk about power sharing, how to assure that it's not only the interests of those at the table but that are discussed, but really to bring them to realize what is the interest for the whole society they are talking about. So kind of bringing in some broader interest into the discussion.
Well, thank you. I think this round showed at least the number of open questions. That's easy said, huh? But also, I think quite a number of them are challenges that are really there and that cannot be easily resolved. And I think sometimes it is really difficult choices. You've got certain issues, for instance, of how bringing parties to the table and making them talk. And again here, how to bring together and have a satisfactory result. Where you can argue that, or where you've got theories about when is the right moment, and perhaps also how much suffering must be there, or how much must the situation be blocked in order to be able to start into peace negotiations. But I think this is also quite unsatisfactory sometimes when you've got the feeling perhaps the right moment is not yet there and you have to wait for it. Can you, for instance, do it with the role of the international community by pressurizing in order to reach this mutually hurting stalemate earlier, that they feel there is no other solution than to engage? Or can you create incentives? In some cases that brought people from the business sector to talk and show, look, perhaps there would be possibilities for investments. Can you create incentives to improve chances of going into it? And I think these are really the question, of course, then also in how far can you support the process with outside actors? Are parties willing to accept a mediator? Will one party demand a mediator and the other one is opposed? Who could be a mediator that is acceptable? These are then all questions that are very much linked to the process. And I think also where, if you come in as an expert, you are more or less confronted with the situation. And I think what this shows also is that that especially if you come in as an expert, but also as a mediator, not everything is in your hands. But you more or less have to deal with the situation. But at least by being aware of all these unsatisfactory questions, one can perhaps better situate the own input and better deal also with frustrations that might be coming out of it. Perhaps going in at the wrong time or talking and then suddenly it does not continue, or let's say everything breaks down, to be also aware that it doesn't necessarily only depend on the input, but that there can be many other things involved. Power asymmetry, perhaps I want to comment only on some issues a little bit from the expert perspective. Power asymmetry, you've got the power asymmetry on the ground, but you might also have a power asymmetry concerning, let's say, knowledge and know-how, or at least the perceived power asymmetry. Some of the parties might think they have less access to knowledge, to input, to know about the options. And if this is the case, then quite often reactions are defensive, and therefore also perhaps more blocking in the process. And the question there is whether there an expert can also bring something by trying to increase the level of knowledge. Perhaps it's not so important to increase the level of knowledge, but to ensure the parties of their knowledge, that what they know, and also how they where they can find the information that is necessary. And there perhaps also that one argument is always, if you do that working only with one party, in order to bring in knowledge there, how will the other parties react? Will they see it as unjust? And in certain situations, then you've got experts working with the different parties. In other cases, it was also argued and saying, there is this asymmetry, and in a way we have to establish it. And there will also be a better negotiating partner if a certain level of knowledge is there. I think the common vision and the confidence building is one of those very tricky issues. And the hope is perhaps that you said what comes first, and perhaps one shouldn't talk about power sharing, but perhaps power sharing to some extent can be the common vision. There I see the risk of going right away into different power sharing mechanisms. And because if you go right away into power sharing mechanisms without creating the vision, you might say, okay, we want federalism, but how you do federalism can be completely different in each case. And whether it corresponds to a vision, or perhaps you come to disagreement because you find out at a certain stage that there was no common vision at all, even though on paper you agreed on power sharing. The whole issue on implementation, we will still come to. The context, when does power sharing work? We didn't go into which mechanisms work best. We didn't go into so much about context. And this out of my own conviction that we know certain things that don't work with power sharing. This we know. But for many things, we do not exactly know why certain things work the way they work, because it's complex and context is also complex. In the end, they work best, I would argue, if they correspond to the context, and if they have big ownership, if people can identify with them. These are, of course, difficult to achieve. But therefore, I think, I sometimes ask myself, of course, input is important, but whether the process, how you get to the power sharing mechanism, is not more important than the power sharing mechanism in the end. And whether not also the process can ensure that you come to more or less acceptable power sharing mechanisms. I think great power sharing mechanisms that work in one place, if the process is wrong and they are not accepted and they do not correspond with the vision, they will not work. And this is, I think, why I for myself, more and more, I start being convinced that you need the knowledge about power sharing, you must be aware of the different options, also that you know the whole huge area that you can choose from. But in the end, I would argue, the process is at least as important, how you got there. And I think this is the huge challenge. It does not, I think it has a very limited sense to parachute experts in who are not linked to the process and who are not, well, not integrated into the process, and who just bring in knowledge. Sometimes it can be useful, but I think it's also very risky. If you bring in an expert at the wrong time, and he perhaps even thinks he knows the solution, and the solution might be the ideal solution, but if he brings it too early on, or he brings it to the wrong people, or he brings it to the wrong space, I think the solution is lost.